Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about some of the Mesopotamian customs of the second millennia BC. Just to sort of put ourselves on track, we have the Assyrian kingdom early in that second millennia. Now, Assyria comes to the foreground. They get their independence. Nineveh is going to be one of those very early cities, and yet we're really not going to talk about the Assyrian Empire until quite a bit later. But right now what we see, both Nineveh and other cities are entering into treaties, these different city-states, and it gives us a picture of life in that era. Cities like Nineveh, cities like Babylon, but what I'd like to do is look at Mari. The Mari tablets were discovered. Mari had been destroyed by Hammurabi, and so that that lets us know a bit when that city was there. André Parot he excavated the city from 1933 to 1938, and then took a break for World War II. Came back in 1952 through 1956, and more than 20,000 tablets were discovered. Now, when we say 20,000 tablets, you're going to think, gee, we know all about Mari. Remember that a lot of these are lists of food supplies that are brought to the king and things like that. So a lot of them are very mundane and ordinary. So when we say 20,000, yes, we have a lot, but we have to wade through a lot of accounting tablets in order to get to any sort of interesting, what we might call the juicy stuff. These tablets are written in Akkadian, and they date from 1800 to around 1750 BC. Remember, we said around 1750 BC. That's Hammurabi's date. So leading up to that point. We have some biblical names that are mentioned in the Mari tablets. People like Noah, Laban, Abram. When we see these names, that's not to say that it's talking about the original Noah or the original Laban or the original Abram or Jacob, but rather there were these names. I don't know if they were commonplace, but they were repeated. We also have a picture of travel and commerce. Things like, I said we have records and things like accounting. We also have contracts that talk about supplies and food stuff and things being brought about from either from the Mediterranean or from the Persian Gulf in the south, and so people were traveling in that day and age. There's also a reference to making a covenant, and the language that is used to kill a young donkey. In other words, when you made a covenant, when you were really serious about it, you would take a young donkey and you would kill it, and in the killing of it, that would be the what's the word for it? Sort of symbolizing that you were sealing your agreement, you were sealing your covenant by the taking of a life. And so effectively what you're doing, you were saying, if I don't keep my word, then what happened to that young donkey is supposed to happen to me. And we're going to see a similar idea in the Bible with that idea of the covenant. In the Old Testament, you wouldn't make a covenant, you would cut a covenant. Not with the donkey, but with some other animal, maybe an oxen or a sheep or something like that. Now, we mentioned Nineveh, Mari, Babylon. Nuzi is another location where we're going to have some tablets that found. Not as much of a major city, actually sort of a minor town, never independent, always usually under somebody else's governorship, and yet the Nuzi tablets are quite enlightening. Nuzi tablets, like I said, this is a smaller town, destroyed around 1450 BC, so it's going to reflect culture earlier than that. And the customs and cultures that we see there are similar to that of the patriarchs. For example, the idea of if a woman could not have a child, and she's married to her husband, and yet she's barren, and it was always assumed, rightly or wrongly, that it was the woman that was barren. But if a woman couldn't have a child, then she was legally obligated to go get a servant, to go get someone who would sort of stand in and be able to bear a child for her, for her husband. And so when we see that taking place in the case of Sarah, she comes up with this idea of using Hagar to bear a son for Abram. Or later on, we have Rachel and Leah each using their handmaidens, sending them into her husband. We think, man, that's just weird. But that was part of the culture and custom, and even in Nuzi, it was actually part of the law. It was a requirement where a wife had to do that. So this idea of children by surrogate for childless couples, we've already mentioned that. Making a slave an heir. We see this takes place in Genesis chapter 15, where Abraham has his chief steward, and that meant, since Abraham doesn't have any children, his chief steward is his heir, and that was again part of the local custom. The wife who is adopted as a sister has greater rights, and that might help explain why we have those instances, not just with Abraham, and in the case of Abraham, we actually find out. Remember, in Genesis chapter 12, we read Abraham saying, well, she's not my wife, she's my sister, but then later on, it's around chapter 20, where he does the same thing, and this time we find out, well, he says, she really is my half-sister. But that's not the case. That's not the case when we get to Isaac, and Isaac does the same thing. She's not my wife, she's my sister. And maybe this was done, at least in part. Now, part of it was done just to protect the guy. He says, live so that I won't be killed, and we're told that. But another part of that motive might have been to protect the wife, in the sense that the wife who is adopted as a sister legally had greater rights. And so there might be an echo of that in the biblical narrative. The importance of a deathbed blessing. And remember the story of Isaac, who's going to bless Esau, and yet Jacob comes in, and he puts on his Esau suit, and he pretends to be Esau, and he steals the blessing. And in our culture, we would look at that and we would say, well, so what? That's not that big of a deal. And yet the Nuzi tablets sort of underscore how important that was, how central that was to the life of a family. And so that was considered to be a very big deal. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is some tablets that were found in Ugarit. They were discovered by a farmer in 1928. He was out farming his field. His plow hit what he thought was it was a rock. Gee, what's this big old rock doing here? Maybe I'd just move it. He moved this big rock, and there was a hole underneath. Actually, it was uncovering the entrance to a cave. Not deliberately, it just sort of worked out that way. And he looked in there, and gee, there's these tablet-looking things. What do I do with these? And a search was made, and it turned out to be an entire city that was located near this town of Ras Shamra. And so here's our map, but Ugarit was right on the ocean. Easy way to remember it is that you have the island of Cyprus has that long finger-liking point where it's pointing to Ugarit. It's sort of reminding you where that is. So the city of Ugarit contained a royal palace with 90 rooms. 2 temples were there. This was a good-sized city. One temple to Baal, the son of El. These were considered, pagan gods of that day. Another one to Dagon. Remember, you hear about him among the Philistines. And the tablets therein, and there were just hundreds and thousands of tablets dating back to the era from 1450 BC, beginning around then, all the way down to 1200 BC. So this is a bit later than Nuzi. Just a later age. And so what this is going to help us with is going to be the Hebrew language. You see, these tablets, they use an alphabet. They look like cuneiform, but it's an alphabetic writing. And it's a Semitic language that is being presented here, and it's related to Hebrew. And there's times when we're reading our Old Testament in the Hebrew text, and you might have an obscure word, and this happens quite a lot, especially in the prophets. There's an obscure word here or there where it's only used one time in the entire Old Testament. Well, how are you going to tell what that word means? And there were a number of times where we didn't have a clue. We could take our best guess. We could look at the Greek translation in the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation, and hope that was right. But now we have a related language that have quite a number of words that are the same, and you can go back and see how that word was used in the Ugaritic language, this other Semitic language. And so that has greatly helped us in our understanding of biblical Hebrew, especially with those rare words, those words that are only used one or two times in the entire Old Testament. There's also Ugaritic poetry, and it's similar to the Hebrew poet, so it helps us understand the poetry better. And it's one thing to understand, basic narrative and sort of basic words. The dog ran out into the field. See Billy and his dog. Those sorts of things that's very simple. But when you get into poetry, now you're getting into nuances that you have to know that language quite a bit better to really get the point. And now we're better able to get the point thanks to our discovery of Ugarit and Ugaritic poetry. I want to show you a picture of a Mycenaean box, ivory box lid that was found in Ugarit. What this is showing us is that you have cultural movement. Now here's a sort of a design box that it had been built and reflects the culture of Mycenae in southern Greece, and yet it's being found in Ugarit. And that tells me that there's trade and travel between these two very different locations. Now, here again, we're still in Ugarit. It's funny because when I first look at the picture, I first think of Mycenae. I've been to Mycenae. I've never been to Ugarit, I have to admit. And we're going to see these temple tombs. They, sort of funny-looking. I think of it as almost like a beehive shape, and I've described it that way sometimes. And I'm going to see the same type of tomb in Mycenae as I see in Ugarit. Now, the Ugaritic tablets, some of the religious practices that are mentioned there. The practice of boiling a kid in its mother's milk is actually mentioned in these Ugaritic tablets. And that's interesting because there was a law in the Mosaic Law, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, and that has led to, among our Jewish friends, to them saying, well, I can't eat milk and I can't eat meat at the same dinner table. And the Bible never says that. They're actually taking that from this prohibition against boiling a kid in its mother's milk. And you say, well, what was that about? Was that sort of adding insult to injury? Was that a ecological sort of thing? Be nice to your animals, or was it a reflection of a religious practice that the Canaanites that was reflected up in Ugarit that they were doing, and you were to stay away from their religious practices? And that seems to be the case by this reference in the Ugaritic tablets. The idea of sacred prostitution, where you would go to the temple and engage with somebody sexually as a part of your worship. Now that was the pagan worship, and that's reflected. The prophets talked about that. They said, "Don't do that sort of thing," and so again we see that pictured and illustrated and described in the Ugaritic tablets. The use of Aramaic expressions that are mirrored in the Bible, and remember the Aramaic language is a very old language, and so we have these sort of expressions that would sort of filter into Hebrew because they were, the Israelites and the Aram, what we call Syria today. They called it Aram back then. These two countries were side by side, and of course they're going to pick up each other's terms and expressions and things like that.